Okay, picking up where we left off, we're on page 812 now. We just finished talking about how you can install the NFS status command, and you can check to see if how the client is doing and how the server is doing. So on page 812, they talk about what's called a dedicated network appliance. Called a net app. That's kind of a brand name, but basically an appliance basically means I just buy a box that has NFS already baked in, and I just jack it into the system and say, okay, everybody can connect to this thing. So it's basically like a miniature version of Linux running on, firmware on a box. The modern day equivalent to that would be a NAS box. Okay, my network attached storage box. I have one from Netgear. My Netgear box runs Linux. Yeah. And I turned on the Windows version of file sharing, which is the next chapter, rather than using NFS because I don't have that many NFS clients to deal with at my home. Okay. On page 812, we talked about what happens if the thing dies. I don't want every client to have to go in and retype the mount command because most likely they're not going to have super user powers to be able to do that. And I guess I could tell them, well, server's back up, you need to reboot your machine. That would be kind of disruptive, right? So instead, we use this thing called AutoFS, which watches for disconnections and then automatically tries to reinstall it. And there's an auto mount administrating tool, and I'm going to skip a bunch of that stuff. Okay, in the lecture notes is a description on exactly how to set up an NFS mount. So basically, all you do is you install the server piece, okay? And then you edit the config file. The exports file. That's it. Edit the exports file, and presto changeo, you're now serving out stuff to the world. Okay? So there's a link in the lecture notes on exactly how to do that because you do have to do this in your term assignment that's coming up. Okay. I'm ready to move on to chapter 22. Which is almost the same topic, except it's the Microsoft version of this rather than the Linux version. So chapter 22, page 819. So let's talk about the history one more time. In 1980, they called this thing the server message block. Horrible name. In 1996, Microsoft said, well, we're going to take over the standard here, by God, and we're going to make a proprietary thing called the Common Internet File System, CIFS. To tell you the truth, that still exists in a very strange way, but all that has been, the right term to describe it is deprecated. I always love that term because it makes it sound like you're going to the dump. Deprecated. But they basically tried to take over that and they got shut down. So in 2006, they said, okay, we're going to call it SMB version 2. And then in 2013, they came out with SMB version 3. So there really isn't anything called CIFS anymore. Not really. The more proper name would be SMB. Okay, just say. Now, in Windows 10, the fall creators update, that's been a while, right? That would be anyway. The SMB version 1 protocol was disabled by default. So I do tech support, and here's one of the questions I get, oddly enough, quite a lot. It's, well, I have a network NAS box that's 10 years old, and I upgraded to Windows 10, and I can't talk to my box no more. Well, it's because you have an old box that only talks SMB version 1, and after this update occurred, that protocol was disabled by default. Now, you could go back in and re-enable it, which is the solution most people give. But just saying that the older one, the version 1, and the one that was called CIFS, those are no longer supported. Okay. So, hey, let me ask you a question. Is it easier to add NFS to Windows, or is it easier to add SMB to Linux? Let's say you had, to me the choice would be if I had 75% of my people were Windows people, well, I'd probably add SMB to the Linux clients. But if 75% of my people were Linux clients, I'd probably add NFS to the Windows client, right? Okay. So there's a thing called services for NFS that's in the add remove in Windows. It's actually pretty easy to do. Not complicated at all. Okay, so the protocol, Microsoft's SMB3, if you want to use that in a third-party way, like not on a Windows platform, you need an open source version of that, and it's called Samba, and kind of sounds like SMB, Samba. So on page 820, they talk about this. So Samba basically is the server-side part of SMB, okay? And it has all sorts of cool features. One of the things it can pretend like it is an Active Directory server. And therefore, it can do authentication and authorization. But for God's sakes, don't do that, okay? I mean, there are an awful lot of other ways to do this, but I'm just saying, wow. If you're using Samba as an Active Directory, fake Active Directory thing, there's an awful lot of better choices for that, okay? Another thing it can do is it can do network printing, but we just did a chapter on cups, and trust me, cups is a hell of a lot better in a Linux world than going through the Microsoft way to be able to get to a printer. So the first two features that we just talked about, I'm recommending that you not use. Even though it is technically possible, there's 5 things that Samba can do, and the first 2 I'm telling you not to do. Okay. The third capability it has is file sharing. Well, duh. Excuse me. That's what we do for a living, right? It could do name resolution. The thing about mapping a user and mapping the things. And then it can do what's called service announcements. Service announcements used to be a lot more prevalent in the version 1 day, where, you know how when you set in the Windows world, you set your machine up, you have an opportunity to say, I want to broadcast all of my shares. We talked about how I'm on a local network and therefore I want to turn on network discovery. Okay, that feature, that's what that is. Network discovery is what they're talking about. Do I want to broadcast the existence of this share to anyone else? Or basically, do they have to just go find it? So, of the 5, file sharing, name resolution, and service announcements are the only 3 of the 5 that I'd recommend you use. Okay, so Samba runs as 2 different daemons. They have one called SMBD, kind of makes sense, which does the authentication, authorization, file, and print services. Hopefully only you're going to be using file services. And then they have an NMB, NND. I don't think I could say this. NMDB, which does the name resolution and service announcements. Okay, here's the weird. Those daemons are not run in the kernel. They're run in user space. Wow. Which means everyone who connects to a client, who connects to the machine, they're just connecting their own thing. I mean, no one else gets to see it. I mean, it's just your little private connection. Your server, the machine that you're currently logged into, right, is not actually participating hardly at all. Okay, so to talk about some comparisons, there's actually a pretty decent comparison list on the differences between SMB and NFS. Okay, so first of all, SMB is in the user space, which means it's not part of the kernel. It's running in low. So that's good because that means there's practically no chance of having a failure in there somehow give elevated privileges, because it's not being run as elevated. It's not being run as root. NFS, okay, yeah, there is a possibility. I don't know what the possibility is, but if somebody found a flaw in there, you could maybe get root access. So per user server process kind of makes sense. So if there's 15 people using it, there's going to be 15 of these things running. In NFS, well, it's just one server for all the clients to deal with, so it's a little bit more efficient. It uses underlying operating system for access control, and then NFS typically does its own thing. Mounters are typically individual users, which means you don't have to have root permission. And on the other hand, the NFS typically would require a mount command, which almost always is going to be a sudo thing. And then halfway decent performance, and then, okay, clearly NFS is the way to go because, you don't have to switch between 2 different worlds. Okay, So in installing and configuring Samba on page 821, so first thing you'd have to do is to create a mount point. Gee, we know how to do that. So make a directory, probably set its permission, and since in our test environment we're probably not going to be dealing with permissions much, we're probably going to, I hate to say fake it, but I don't want to have to get you in there and do it the right way. The right way would be installing some sort of third-party scenario, and we're not doing that. So I would set the owner and group to nobody and no group. Okay, that just makes it easy. It's almost the same thing as like turning anonymous on. Basically say map everyone to that, don't worry about it. And then we do apt get install Samba. I'm not going to type it, but you know what we're talking about. And then there's, well, yes, I guess I am going to do it. Doggone it. Because I need to have the symbol thing run on it. So here we go. So sudo apt install Samba. It helps if you spell it right. Okay, so here we go. By the way, if you're later on, we're going to install another version of Linux. We're going to install the GUI version, the workstation version, and a lot of the stuff is automatically built in. You know, for example, the NFS client and the Samba client are built in. You don't actually have to do an install on this thing, which is kind of weird. Okay, so while that's cooking, let's talk. So there's a thing called SMB status, just like the other one was called NFS status, right? Same thing. So I'm going to run mine. Of course, it's not going to say much, is it? Right? SMB status. Oh, well. Not that it's going to work anyway. And it basically says, hey, here's all the stuff we got, which is nothing. Okay, cool. All right. There's a configuration file. Gee, what a surprise. Is how you go in and make a share available. Just like we had the etc. export guy. Remember that guy? Well, this one is etc. Samba SMB config. Let's go take a peek. So I'm just going to do vi etc. SMB, or is it Samba? Is it the word Samba? You gonna make me look, doggone it. It is Samba. Samba SMB config. Okay. So here is a configuration file that basically goes through and says, you know, here's how. Remember, we're faking a lot of things. For example, if you're making this, you want to, with the discovery turned on, you want to show what work group you're on, you know, that kind of stuff. So this is pretty straightforward stuff about, you know, what work group, what server name, and then you're going to go in here. You're going to put something in square brackets if we ever get to the end here. Good grief, this thing is huge. Okay, where I have, like in this case, printers, and so the thing in square brackets is one of these what they call a resource. So I would go in here and I would add the name of a share to do that. So one of the things we need to talk about is there's a thing called local authentication. So if I want to turn on local authentication and make it completely anonymous, what I would do is I would go to this section right here and I would tell it that I want the security be equal to the user, okay? The guest account would be okay, and then I'm going to force the user to be nobody, which means that's how you would do. So turn it into saying, hey, I want to connect as users. I want to map any user, no matter who they are, to nobody, and then I'll allow guests to open up. So that's an anonymous way of doing it. The typical way you would do it is you would have security equals users, guest equals no, and then valid users, and you would use a group. You would create a group on your machine and say, here are the 5 people that have permission to be able to get to that. Okay, that's kind of how it works. So we're coming up on the 15-minute mark. Let's stop this and pick it up.